The people you ignore in the room are usually the ones holding the real power. Rain hammered against the glass walls of Cole Tower like handfuls of thrown gravel, turning Manhattan into a blur of silver lights and distorted reflections 60 floors below. Inside the executive dining hall, crystal chandeliers glowed softly over polished marble floors, while men in tailored suits discussed billion-dollar acquisitions with the calm detachment of people who had never worried about rent, debt, or whether their card would decline at the grocery store. Claire Whitmore moved silently between the tables, carrying a silver tray balanced effortlessly in one hand, her black waitress uniform perfectly pressed despite the chaos of the evening rush. She looked exactly like what everyone assumed she was. Just another server working late in a luxury building filled with people too important to notice her. Table 12 needs another bottle of Bordeaux, the floor manager whispered sharply as he passed her. And try not to interrupt Mr. Cole tonight. He's already in a mood. Claire nodded once. Calm, polite, invisible. Across the room, Ethan Cole adjusted the cuff of his Swiss watch without looking up from the acquisition reports spread across the private dining table in front of him. At 38, he had the kind of face business magazines love to print beside words like ruthless, visionary, and untouchable. Sharp jaw, controlled expression, expensive navy suit tailored close to his athletic frame. Everything about him suggested precision. Even the way he held his wine glass looked rehearsed. Around him sat 8 board members and investors preparing to finalize the largest merger in company history by midnight. Nearly $4 billion. One signature away from changing the future of Cole International forever. If legal clears the final clause, we announce before market open, Ethan said evenly, his voice smooth enough to silence the room instantly. No surprises. No delays. Claire stepped beside the table and refilled a glass without disturbing the conversation. Most executives ignored servers automatically, the same way they ignored elevator music or city traffic. Ethan barely glanced at her. Then one of the older investors frowned at the paperwork in front of him. Section 8 still looks off to me, he muttered. Ethan's irritation flashed immediately. It's already been reviewed twice. Still, the investor said quietly, the acquisition clause conflicts with the ownership structure. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose, the expression of a man exhausted by everyone else's incompetence. Legal confirmed it this afternoon. Claire set the wine bottle down gently. For half a second, her eyes moved across the document lying open near Ethan's hand. Then she spoke softly. Actually, Section 8 voids the voting protections if the minority shareholders challenge the merger in federal court. Silence. Not dramatic silence. Worse, the kind that freezes a room because nobody expected the interruption to happen at all. Ethan looked up slowly. His gray eyes locked onto hers for the first time that night. Excuse me. Claire immediately lowered her gaze again. I'm sorry, sir. Her voice remained calm. I only noticed because the wording references 2 different ownership classifications. One of the attorneys blinked and grabbed the document. Pages shuffled quickly. Another board member leaned closer. Ethan's expression hardened. Since when does the waitstaff review corporate contracts? A few uncomfortable laughs circled the table. Claire didn't react. I wasn't reviewing it, she answered quietly. I was pouring your wine. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her now with visible annoyance. Rain streaked down the windows behind him while distant thunder rolled somewhere over the city. Interesting, he said coldly. A waitress with legal opinions. Claire folded her hands neatly behind her back. Just an observation. Ethan gave a humorless smile. Then maybe you should stay focused on observations involving food and wine instead of billion-dollar transactions. Around the table, several executives smirked into their glasses. Claire simply nodded once. No anger. No embarrassment, just stillness. But as she turned to leave, the senior attorney quietly cleared his throat while staring at the contract in disbelief. Mr. Cole, he said carefully, she's right. The room changed after that. Not loudly, not instantly, but enough for everyone to feel it. For a moment, nobody at the table moved. The only sound came from the rain tapping softly against the massive glass windows overlooking Manhattan. Ethan stared at the attorney beside him while the older man adjusted his glasses and reread the contract for a second time, slower now. She is correct, the attorney repeated carefully. If the minority shareholders contest the merger, The wording in Section 8 weakens the voting protections entirely. One of the investors sat forward immediately. How did we miss that? Another executive flipped through the pages with growing panic, while two legal assistants whispered urgently to each other near the end of the table. Ethan's jaw tightened. He did not like surprises. He liked control. And right now, control was slipping through his fingers because of a woman holding a silver serving tray. Claire stood quietly beside the table, posture straight, expression unreadable. She did not look proud of herself. She did not look nervous either. Somehow that bothered Ethan more than if she had. Most people reacted when they challenged him. They became defensive, emotional, eager to prove themselves. Claire simply waited, calm as still water. "What is your name?" one of the board members suddenly asked. "Claire," she answered softly. "Claire Whitmore." Ethan leaned back in his chair slowly, studying her with new attention. The room felt different now, smaller somehow. The executives who had ignored her 10 minutes earlier were suddenly looking at her, as if they were trying to solve a puzzle. "Interesting observation for a waitress," Ethan said finally, his tone smooth but edged with irritation. "You must spend your free time reading merger agreements for fun." A few restrained laughs circled the table again, though weaker this time. Claire met his eyes briefly. Not usually. Ethan noticed something then. She never rushed her answers, never stumbled over her words. Even standing under the attention of an entire executive board, her breathing remained steady. That level of composure was rare. "Where did you study?" Ethan asked casually. Claire picked up the empty wine bottle from the table. "Community college," she replied. "Mostly night classes." Another lie, Ethan thought instantly. He could hear it in the precision of her speech. The vocabulary. The confidence. Nobody analyzed acquisition loopholes like that after a few night classes. One of the younger investors gave a dismissive shrug. "Well, wherever she learned it probably just saved us a lawsuit." The senior attorney nodded reluctantly. Potentially a very expensive one. Ethan's expression darkened slightly. He hated owing favors, especially public ones. Claire reached for another glass to refill it, but Ethan stopped her with a quiet voice. "Leave the bottle." She paused. "Sir, you seem interested in corporate law tonight." Ethan folded his hands together slowly. "Sit down for a moment." Several executives exchanged surprised glances immediately. The request itself was unusual. Ethan Cole did not invite servers into executive discussions. Claire looked toward the floor manager, standing nervously near the kitchen entrance. "I am still working." "You are on my floor," Ethan replied evenly. "That makes it my decision." The manager nodded so quickly it almost looked painful. "Of course, Mr. Cole. Take whatever time you need." Claire hesitated for half a second before placing the tray down carefully and sitting at the far end of the long table. The contrast was striking. Black waitress uniforms surrounded by tailored Italian suits worth more than most people's monthly rent. Yet somehow she looked more comfortable than half the executives in the room. Ethan noticed that too. "Tell me something, Claire," he said. "How does someone serving drinks at a corporate dinner recognize a federal shareholder vulnerability in under 10 seconds? Claire folded her hands neatly in her lap. "I read quickly." A board member laughed under his breath. Ethan did not. "No," he said quietly. "That answer is too simple." The chandeliers reflected softly against the crystal glasses between them while thunder rolled somewhere over the East River. Claire glanced toward the windows for a moment before answering. "My father used to say contracts are like people. The most dangerous flaws are usually hidden in the small print nobody respects enough to read." Ethan narrowed his eyes slightly. "Your father was a lawyer?" "Something like that." Again, not a real answer. Ethan could feel it. The room could too. One of the investors leaned toward another and whispered, but Ethan barely heard them anymore. His attention remained fixed on Claire, on the strange contradiction she represented. She moved like someone accustomed to wealth, spoke like someone highly educated, but wore a waitress uniform without embarrassment. It did not fit together. "You know," Ethan said slowly, "most people in this city spend their entire lives trying to sit at tables like this." Claire looked around the executive dining room once before answering. "And most people sitting at tables like this spend their entire lives forgetting how to see the people standing beside them." Silence again, heavier this time. One executive suddenly became very interested in his drink. Another cleared his throat awkwardly. Ethan held her gaze a second longer than intended. There it was again. Not fear, not ambition, something worse. Claire Whitmore spoke to him like a man. Not a billionaire. Not a CEO. Just a man. And Ethan Cole was not used to that. The tension around the table did not disappear after Claire spoke. It settled deeper instead, like smoke slowly filling a locked room. Ethan picked up his glass, but did not drink from it. His eyes remained fixed on her with quiet suspicion, while the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Somewhere behind them, servers moved carefully between tables, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Interesting philosophy, Ethan said at last. Did your father also teach you how to lecture executives during dinner service? Claire looked down briefly at the white linen tablecloth before meeting his gaze again. No, sir. He taught me that embarrassment usually reveals more about the powerful than the powerless. One of the investors nearly choked on his drink. Another lowered his eyes entirely, suddenly fascinated by the merger documents spread across the table. Ethan felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Not anger exactly. Challenge. Claire Whitmore spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had nothing to prove, and that unsettled him more than open defiance ever could. Most people tried to impress wealthy men. Claire seemed completely uninterested in the effort. You are very confident for someone wearing an apron, Ethan said coolly. Claire glanced down at the black uniform tied neatly at her waist. Clothes are temporary. Then she looked back at him. People tend to forget that. The room went still again. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair, studying her more carefully now. There was no hesitation in her voice, no nervous movement in her hands. Even her posture remained relaxed beneath the attention of 9 executives and a billionaire CEO known for destroying careers with a single conversation. One of the older board members suddenly spoke up. Claire, how exactly did you notice the issue in the contract that quickly? She answered without drama. The wording repeated itself. That is all. No, her voice softened slightly. The structure felt careless. Ethan's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Careless. Nobody used that word around him. Cole International had built its reputation on precision, control, ruthless efficiency, and now a waitress sitting at the edge of his executive table was calmly describing a $4 billion merger as careless. Rain continued sliding down the windows and silver lines behind her, while thunder echoed faintly over the city skyline. Ethan folded the contract shut. You keep speaking as though you understand this world. Claire tilted her head slightly. Maybe I do. From community college? Ethan asked. There it was again. That almost invisible pause before she answered. Tiny, barely noticeable. But Ethan noticed everything. Education is not always listed on paper, she said quietly. Neither is intelligence. One investor let out a low whistle under his breath before quickly pretending he had not. Ethan stared at her for another long moment. Then, without warning, he smiled slightly. It was not a warm smile. It was the expression he used before negotiations. Turned dangerous. All right, he said smoothly. Let us test that theory. Several executives straightened immediately. They recognized the tone. Ethan rested his elbows lightly on the table. You seem very comfortable discussing contracts. Finance. Corporate law. His gray eyes narrowed slightly. So tell me, Claire, if federal rates rise another 0.25% before Q4, what happens to leveraged acquisition debt across emerging tech sectors? The room shifted instantly. This was no longer conversation. It was performance. A test disguised as curiosity. Claire understood that immediately. So did everyone else. Ethan expected hesitation now. Confusion. Maybe embarrassment. Instead, Claire reached for the water glass beside her and took a small sip before answering. Calm. Unhurried. Short-term acquisition financing becomes more expensive, she said softly. Most firms compensate by reducing expansion speed or restructuring debt timelines. But companies relying heavily on inflated growth projections usually collapse first because investor confidence disappears before liquidity does. Silence. Ethan's expression did not move. But one of the younger executives slowly lowered the pen he had been holding. Claire continued quietly. Especially in companies prioritizing public valuation over stable infrastructure. Another board member looked toward Ethan almost nervously. The implication was obvious. Cole International had spent the last 3 years aggressively expanding into unstable tech markets. Ethan tapped one finger once against the table. Interesting answer. Claire placed the glass back down carefully. You asked. He gave another small smile. Colder this time. Do not mistake curiosity for respect. Claire did not react immediately. She simply folded her hands again while distant lightning flashed beyond the windows. Then she answered in the same calm voice that had unsettled him since the moment she spoke. Do not mistake a uniform for weakness. For the first time that night, nobody at the table laughed. The air inside the executive dining room felt heavier now, charged with something nobody could comfortably name. Outside, rain continued, flooding the Manhattan streets far below, but inside Cole Tower, every eye remained fixed on Claire Whitmore. Ethan slowly rotated the crystal glass in his hand without drinking from it. The faint clink of melting ice echoed softly against the silence. He had spent most of his adult life controlling rooms exactly like this one. Investors listened when he spoke. Executives adjusted themselves around his mood. Opponents usually folded before negotiations even reached the difficult part. But Claire did not fold. She did not even flinch. That bothered him more than he wanted to admit. You speak very carefully, Ethan said at last, almost like someone trained for negotiations. Claire gave a small shrug. Careful people survive longer. Ethan watched her for another second, then another. Around them, the executives shifted quietly, sensing the tension growing sharper beneath the surface politeness. One of the board members attempted a nervous laugh. Well, perhaps we should hire her for strategy meetings. A few weak smiles appeared around the table, but Ethan never looked away from Claire. Maybe, he said calmly. Or maybe she is simply good at pretending. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the polished table. Most wealthy people are. The comment landed softly. Too softly. Like a knife wrapped in silk. One investor coughed into his hand to hide a reaction, while another suddenly became interested in checking his phone. Ethan's expression remained unreadable. You seem to have strong opinions about wealthy people for someone working inside their buildings. Claire answered without hesitation. Working near power teaches you things. Such as, Ethan asked. She glanced toward the rain sliding down the windows before speaking. How quickly kindness disappears when status enters the room. Nobody interrupted her this time. Ethan leaned forward slightly. And yet you continue serving people you clearly do not respect. Claire shook her head once. No, I respect people. Her eyes lifted back to his. I just do not confuse money with character. Another silence settled over the table. Ethan realized something uncomfortable then. Claire was not trying to impress anyone in the room. Not the investors. Not the executives. Certainly not him. She spoke with the strange freedom of someone who had nothing to gain and nothing to lose. That kind of confidence was dangerous. One of the younger attorneys attempted to redirect the mood. Mr. Cole, perhaps we should revisit the merger projections before midnight. Ethan barely acknowledged him. In a minute. His attention never left Claire. Tell me something honestly, he said quietly. If you dislike people like us so much, why work here at all? Claire looked down at the folded napkin beside her untouched water glass. When she spoke again, her voice softened almost imperceptibly. Because sometimes the only way to understand powerful people is to watch how they treat someone they think cannot affect them. The words settled heavily across the room. Ethan felt them more than he expected. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were true. He remembered the way he had spoken to her earlier that evening. The dismissive tone. The casual superiority. For the first time all night, a small crack of discomfort moved through him. Claire saw it immediately. Her expression did not change. You are analyzing me now, Ethan observed. No, she replied calmly. You are analyzing yourself. One of the board members shifted in his seat so abruptly that the leather chair creaked loudly beneath him. Ethan slowly exhaled through his nose. The woman sitting across from him in a simple waitress uniform had somehow turned an executive dinner into something personal, and he no longer knew when exactly that had happened. You enjoy this, do you not? He asked. Making executives uncomfortable. Claire gave the faintest smile of the night. Not mocking. Almost sad. No, Mr. Cole. I think uncomfortable people simply reveal themselves faster. Lightning flashed faintly outside the windows, illuminating the city skyline in silver for half a second before darkness returned. Ethan loosened his tie slightly for the first time that evening. You speak like someone who has spent years around boardrooms. Claire looked at him carefully. Maybe I have. As what? Ethan asked immediately. An assistant? Consultant? Analyst? Claire tilted her head slightly. Would it matter? Yes. Why? Ethan paused. The answer should have been obvious. Yet somehow, sitting across from her now, it no longer felt simple. Claire watched the hesitation cross his face. Then she stood slowly from the table and reached for the silver tray beside her. Your investors are waiting for the updated numbers, she said softly. And your attorney should rewrite Section 8 before midnight. Ethan looked up at her immediately. How do you know the revision can be completed before midnight? Claire slid the empty glasses carefully onto the tray one by one. Because if legal starts now, they still have 1 hour and 42 minutes before Asian markets open. The room froze again. Several executives instinctively checked their watches. Ethan did not move at all. Claire balanced the tray effortlessly against one hand and gave a small polite nod. Good night, Mr. Cole. Then she turned and walked away through the glowing dining hall while the executives stared after her in complete silence. Ethan watched her disappear beyond the glass doors, and for the first time in years, he had the unsettling feeling that he was the only person in the room who understood absolutely nothing. Ethan remained seated long after Claire disappeared beyond the dining hall doors. Around him, the executives slowly returned to their conversations, though the energy in the room had changed completely. Nobody spoke as confidently now. The merger documents spread across the marble table suddenly looked fragile beneath the soft chandelier light. One mistake hidden in Section 8 had nearly cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars, and a waitress had found it faster than an entire legal department. Ethan hated that fact more than he wanted to admit. Sir, the senior attorney asked cautiously, should we proceed with the revisions? Ethan blinked once, forcing himself back into the room. Do it, he said flatly. Tonight. The attorney nodded quickly and gathered the paperwork. Chairs moved. Quiet conversations resumed. But Ethan barely heard any of it anymore. His mind remained fixed on Claire Whitmore. The way she spoke, the way she watched people, the strange certainty behind every answer she gave. None of it made sense. You are distracted, one of the older investors observed carefully after several minutes. Ethan loosened his cufflinks slightly. No, you have reread the same page 4 times. Ethan glanced down at the untouched report in front of him. The investor smiled faintly into his wine glass. Interesting woman. Ethan gave no response. Outside, rain continued washing silver across the city skyline, while midnight crept closer. The executive dinner eventually dissolved into smaller conversations as legal teams rushed to revise the merger documents downstairs. Some executives left entirely. Others remained near the bar discussing market reactions and shareholder optics. Ethan finally stood from the table and buttoned his jacket slowly. Mr. Cole, his assistant asked immediately. Your car is waiting downstairs. Ethan looked toward the hallway where Claire had disappeared nearly 30 minutes earlier. Cancel it. Sir, I said cancel it. The assistant hesitated only briefly before nodding. Ethan walked through the executive corridor alone, passing framed photographs of company milestones lining the walls. Billion-dollar acquisitions, magazine covers, handshakes with politicians and investors. Every image reflected power, success, control. Yet tonight, none of it felt particularly impressive. He reached the private service hallway near the kitchen entrance and stopped. The atmosphere changed instantly back there. The polished executive image of Cole Tower disappeared behind stainless steel counters, rolling carts, and exhausted employees finishing the late shift. Waiters loosened ties. Dishwashers stacked trays. Someone laughed softly near the coffee station. Real life. Unfiltered. Ethan rarely entered this side of the building. The kitchen manager nearly dropped a clipboard when he saw him. Mr. Cole, we were not expecting you down here. Ethan ignored the nervous greeting. Where is Claire Whitmore? The manager blinked in surprise. Claire, the waitress from the executive floor. She should still be on break near the staff lounge. Ethan nodded once and continued walking before the manager could say another word. He found her sitting alone beside a small window overlooking the rain-covered alley behind the tower. The contrast startled him for a moment. Upstairs, executives drank $1,000 wine discussing mergers. Down here, fluorescent lights buzzed softly above cracked tile floors while Claire sat with a paper cup of coffee warming her hands. She looked up when she noticed him. No surprise crossed her face, almost as though she had expected him eventually. Mr. Cole. Ethan stopped a few feet away. You knew the merger timeline without looking at a clock. Claire took a small sip of coffee. Most people who work nights become familiar with time. You also knew the legal structure of the acquisition. I read quickly, remember? Ethan slipped one hand into his pocket. And your understanding of leveraged debt? Claire looked toward the rain outside the narrow window. Books are free at public libraries. Ethan almost smiled despite himself. Every answer she gave somehow revealed nothing while exposing everything at the same time. He was not accustomed to conversations he could not control. You enjoy doing this, he said quietly, avoiding direct answers. Claire looked back at him calmly. You enjoy demanding them. A server pushing a cart nearby suddenly changed direction to avoid interrupting the strange tension between them. Ethan noticed the movement from the corner of his eye. Even here, people adjusted themselves around him automatically. Everyone except Claire. You embarrass me tonight, he said finally. Claire's expression softened slightly for the first time. No, her voice remained gentle. You embarrassed yourself. The honesty of it hit harder than anger would have. Ethan looked away briefly toward the rain sliding down the glass. Somewhere above them, 70 floors higher, lawyers were still rewriting contracts because of her. Most people would have used that moment differently, he admitted quietly. They would have demanded something. Claire gave a faint smile into the steam rising from her coffee cup. That is because most people think power is loud. Ethan studied her carefully beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Simple black uniform. No jewelry except a thin silver watch on her wrist. Hair pulled back neatly after a long shift. Yet somehow she carried herself with more quiet authority than half the executives sitting upstairs. Then what is power? He asked before he could stop himself. Claire held his gaze for a long moment. Being underestimated, she answered softly, and never needing to correct anyone. The fluorescent lights above them buzzed softly while rainwater crawled down the narrow basement window beside Claire's shoulder. Somewhere deeper in the kitchen, dishes clattered faintly and exhausted employees prepared for closing. But inside the small staff lounge, the silence between Ethan Cole and Claire Whitmore felt strangely separate from the rest of the building. Ethan leaned lightly against the doorway, studying her with the same intensity he normally reserved for negotiations worth billions of dollars. Claire remained seated beside the window with her paper coffee cup resting between her hands, completely unbothered by the attention. Being underestimated, Ethan repeated quietly. That is your definition of power. Claire gave a small nod. People reveal themselves around someone they think does not matter. Ethan crossed his arms slowly. And what exactly have people revealed to you here? Claire looked toward the rain outside again. Enough. The answer irritated him immediately. Not because it was disrespectful, because it was incomplete. Ethan had built his empire on information. Numbers. Predictable outcomes. Claire spoke in fragments that somehow carried more weight than direct explanations. You keep doing that, he said, answering questions without actually answering them. Claire smiled faintly into her coffee. You keep asking questions you already think you know the answer to. Ethan almost responded immediately, then stopped himself. She was right. He had spent the entire evening trying to place her into a category he could understand. Employee, analyst, former consultant. Maybe the daughter of some wealthy executive hiding from her family. But none of the explanations fit completely. You do not belong here, he said finally. Claire looked around the small staff lounge. Scuffed floors, dent in the vending machine, cheap fluorescent lights. Neither do most people working 3 jobs to survive Manhattan rent, she answered calmly. Ethan shook his head slightly. That is not what I meant. I know. A quiet pause followed. Ethan glanced toward the silver watch resting on her wrist. Simple design. Old, but elegant in a way expensive things often tried too hard to imitate. Who taught you finance? He asked. Claire traced one finger slowly along the edge of the paper coffee cup. Someone who believed money reveals character faster than poverty does. Your father again? She looked up at him. You ask about him often for someone pretending not to be curious. Ethan exhaled softly through his nose. Curiosity is efficient. No, Claire replied quietly. Curiosity is human. The words lingered in the room longer than either expected. Ethan looked away first. Somewhere upstairs, an elevator chimed softly. Midnight was getting closer. The merger revisions were probably nearing completion by now, yet Ethan remained downstairs speaking with a waitress instead of reviewing billion-dollar contracts. The realization felt absurd. You know what bothers me most? He asked after a moment. Claire waited silently. You speak to me like none of this matters. He gestured vaguely upward toward the tower above them. The company, the money, the board. Claire's expression softened slightly. It matters to you. Of course it does. Then that should be enough. Ethan stared at her for a second. Most people would kill for access to rooms like that. Claire shook her head gently. No. Most people would sacrifice themselves for acceptance from rooms like that. Her voice remained calm, but Ethan felt something unexpectedly sad beneath it. There is a difference. The hallway outside the lounge suddenly filled with hurried footsteps. A young legal assistant appeared breathless near the doorway holding a stack of revised documents against his chest. He froze the moment he saw Ethan standing there. Mr. Cole, I have been looking everywhere for you. Ethan straightened. Immediately, the familiar executive mask returning almost automatically. Is legal finished? Yes, sir. Final revisions are complete. The assistant hesitated awkwardly before glancing toward Claire sitting by the window. Actually, he adjusted the papers nervously. The senior attorneys wanted me to mention something. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. What? The legal team reviewed the original acquisition structure after the issue tonight. He swallowed carefully. They said the loophole was so subtle that only someone deeply familiar with the founding shareholder agreements probably would have caught it immediately. Ethan looked toward Claire again. She remained completely still, eyes lowered toward her coffee cup. The assistant continued nervously. One attorney even said whoever noticed it must have studied the original Whitmore corporate filings personally. Silence. Ethan's attention shifted back to Claire slowly now. Deliberately. Whitmore, he repeated quietly. Claire said nothing. The assistant blinked between them uncertainly. Should I leave the documents upstairs, sir? Ethan never looked away from Claire. Yes. The assistant nodded quickly and disappeared down the hallway almost immediately. The silence that followed felt different now. Sharper. Ethan stepped farther into the room. Whitmore, he repeated again. As in Daniel Whitmore? Claire finally lifted her eyes toward him. Calm. Steady. Dangerous in a way he was only beginning to understand. That depends, she said softly. How much do you know about the company you run? The rain outside had softened into a steady whisper against the narrow basement window, but inside the staff lounge, the silence between Ethan Cole and Claire Whitmore felt louder than anything else in the building. Ethan stared at her without blinking, the name still echoing in his mind. Whitmore. Daniel Whitmore. Founder of Whitmore and Cole Holdings before the company became the billion-dollar empire now known as Cole International. The name had not appeared publicly in years. Not after Daniel Whitmore died and Ethan's father consolidated control of the company decades earlier. That is impossible, Ethan said. Quietly. Claire tilted her head slightly. Is it? Ethan straightened slowly, his expression hardening into the cold executive calm that had intimidated investors and competitors for years. Daniel Whitmore had no children. Claire gave a faint smile. Not amused. More disappointed than anything else. That is the version your board prefers. Ethan felt his jaw tighten immediately. Careful. About what? She asked softly. The truth. The fluorescent lights above them hummed faintly, while distant elevator doors opened and closed somewhere down the corridor. Ethan looked at her differently now. Not as a waitress. Not even as an unusual employee. As a threat. Or perhaps something worse. An unknown variable tied directly to the foundation of his company. Who are you? He asked again, quieter this time. Claire stood slowly from the chair beside the window and set the empty coffee cup down carefully on the small table beside her. You already know my name. That is not what I asked. Claire smoothed the sleeve of her black uniform calmly before answering. Daniel Whitmore was my grandfather. Ethan froze completely. Not visibly, not dramatically, but inside. The sentence landed with enough force to rearrange everything he thought he understood about the company upstairs. No, he said automatically. Your grandfather's shares were dissolved after his death. That is what your father told the board. Ethan's eyes narrowed sharply. My father built this company. No, Claire replied gently. He inherited half of it. Silence crashed into the room again. Ethan suddenly understood why she had recognized the merger loophole so quickly. Why the legal language felt familiar to her. Why she spoke about the company with the strange confidence of someone who belonged inside it. You are lying, he said, though the certainty in his voice had weakened slightly. Claire reached into the pocket of her uniform apron and removed a small silver key card holder. From inside it, She slid out a folded document worn soft at the edges with age. Ethan watched her unfold it slowly beneath the fluorescent light. Then she handed it to him. He took it automatically. The paper carried the faded letterhead of Whitmore and Cole Holdings dated nearly 28 years earlier. Ethan's eyes scanned the signatures first. Daniel Whitmore, Arthur Cole. Then farther down the page. Trust allocation percentages, founding shareholder protections, succession clauses, and one line highlighted in blue ink. 50% ownership transferred to Whitmore family descendants under private trust protection. Ethan stopped breathing for half a second. This document was sealed, he said quietly. Yes. Claire's voice remained calm, which is why nobody expected a waitress to have it. Ethan looked up at her slowly. My father never mentioned any surviving heirs. Claire folded her arms lightly. Your father never mentioned many things. The words carried no bitterness. Somehow that made them heavier. Ethan looked back down at the document again. Every signature was authentic. Every seal legitimate. Years of board meetings suddenly replayed differently inside his head. Decisions, ownership structures, voting protections, hidden trust allocations buried beneath layers of corporate revisions. His father had not erased the Whitmore family entirely. He had buried them inside paperwork nobody bothered to read closely anymore. Except Claire had read it. Every line, every clause, every hidden detail. Why are you working as a waitress? Ethan asked finally, almost unable to process the absurdity of the question now. Claire looked toward the rain sliding down the basement window. Because people speak honestly around service workers. You spent months here observing us. 6 months. Ethan stared at her in disbelief. That is insane. No, Claire met his eyes again. It is informative. Ethan ran one hand slowly across his jaw, trying to steady the sudden flood of realization moving through him. Upstairs, executives had laughed at her, dismissed her, spoken around her as though she were invisible, including him, especially him. You could have walked into the boardroom any time you wanted, he said quietly. Claire nodded once. Yes. Then why did you not? For the first time all night, Claire hesitated before answering. Just briefly. Because I wanted to know whether the people running this company respected human beings before they respected titles. Ethan felt the weight of those words settle directly into his chest. Claire stepped closer now, still wearing the simple black waitress uniform that suddenly looked almost symbolic beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. You were never being evaluated as a CEO tonight, Ethan, she said softly. You were being evaluated as a person. And standing there in the basement staff lounge beneath 70 floors of power and money, Ethan Cole realized he had failed long before he ever noticed the test had begun. For several long seconds, neither of them moved. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above the staff lounge while rain slid down the basement window in slow silver lines. Ethan still held the faded shareholder document in his hand, staring at the signatures that had quietly rewritten everything he believed about his company. Claire watched him calmly, not triumphant, not angry. Somehow that made the moment even harder to process. Most people would have enjoyed watching a billionaire lose control of the room. Claire looked almost saddened by it. Ethan lowered the document slowly. The board does not know about you. Claire shook her head once. No, the trust has never been activated. No. Ethan let out a quiet breath through his nose, trying to steady the wave of realization moving through him. You could have destroyed this company publicly tonight. Claire's expression softened slightly. Why would I destroy something my grandfather built? Ethan looked at her carefully. After the way you were treated here? Claire glanced toward the hallway outside the lounge where exhausted kitchen staff continued cleaning after the executive dinner upstairs. People fail each other, she said quietly. That does not mean the entire company deserves to collapse. Ethan studied her in silence. He had spent years surrounded by people obsessed with leverage, revenge, advantage, and public image. Claire spoke about power differently, like someone who had already learned how empty it became when stripped of humanity. You said you have been here 6 months, Ethan finally said. Watching. Everyone. Claire nodded lightly. And? Ethan asked. What did you decide? She looked at him for a long moment before answering. Most people in this building are afraid. Ethan frowned slightly. Afraid of what? Losing status. Losing control. Losing relevance. Her eyes moved briefly toward the ceiling above them. People become cruel when they think power is the only thing protecting them. Ethan looked away first. The words landed too close to truth. He suddenly remembered dozens of moments from the past year. Executives competing against each other instead of working together. Managers humiliating assistants in meetings. Investors treating employees like invisible furniture. And himself speaking to Claire at the executive table earlier that night, without even considering the possibility that she deserved respect before she earned status. The realization settled heavily inside him. "You already judged me," he said quietly. Claire tilted her head slightly. "No, you literally said I failed. I said you failed the test tonight." Her voice remained calm. "That is not the same thing as failing permanently." Ethan looked at her again, surprised by the distinction. Most people either idolized him or resented him. Claire somehow managed to do neither. "Why did you really stay hidden?" he asked after a moment. "If this company legally belongs half to you, why spend 6 months carrying trays and serving drinks?" Claire folded her arms lightly against the black uniform she still wore. "Because titles distort reality." Ethan said nothing. Claire continued softly. "The moment people know who you are, they stop showing you who they are." The sentence hung quietly in the room. Ethan realized she was right. Every boardroom he entered changed instantly around him. Employees straightened their posture. Executives softened difficult truths. Investors smiled too quickly. Nobody interacted naturally with power. Nobody except Claire. "My father knew about the trust?" Ethan asked carefully. Claire's expression dimmed slightly for the first time. "Yes." "Then why hide it?" She looked down briefly before answering. "Because after my grandfather died, the board believed one family controlling the company would create stability. And your family agreed to disappear?" Claire gave a faint smile without humor. "My mother was tired of fighting people who only respected money." Ethan stared at the shareholder document again. Decades of silence hidden beneath legal language and corporate branding. "So this entire time," he said slowly, "you could have walked upstairs and claimed your seat at the board table." "Yes. But instead you chose to work downstairs where nobody respected you." Claire looked directly at him now. Respect that only appears after a title is not respect. The simplicity of the statement hit harder than any accusation could have. Ethan suddenly became aware of how differently he had spoken to her once he realized she mattered financially. The thought unsettled him immediately. Claire noticed the shift in his expression. Of course she did. She seemed to notice everything. "That is why I stayed hidden," she said softly. "Not to expose contracts. Not to embarrass executives." Her eyes held his steadily. "I wanted to know whether anyone inside this company still understood how to treat people before they knew who they were." Ethan felt the weight of those words settle deeper than he expected. Upstairs, lawyers, investors, and executives still moved through the tower believing they understood power. Meanwhile, the woman who legally owned half the company stood quietly in a basement staff lounge, wearing a waitress uniform no one had bothered to look past. Claire stepped toward the doorway slowly, preparing to leave. Then she paused beside him. "Tomorrow morning," she said calmly, "the board will learn the truth." Ethan looked at her immediately. "You are announcing the trust?" Claire nodded once. "It is time." A long silence followed. Then Ethan asked the question that mattered more than any contract upstairs. "And after tonight, do you still want to be part of this company?" Claire looked at him carefully. Rain shimmered behind her in the basement window while the fluorescent lights cast soft reflections against the silver watch on her wrist. "That depends," she said quietly, "on whether the people leading it are finally willing to see those standing beside them." By 8:30 the next morning, the rain had stopped completely. Manhattan glowed beneath pale sunlight, reflecting off wet sidewalks and glass towers, while black cars lined the entrance of Cole International one after another. Executives stepped through the revolving doors carrying tablets, coffee cups, and the quiet tension of people summoned into an emergency board meeting without explanation. Rumors had already begun spreading before sunrise. Legal activity overnight. Revised shareholder filings. Confidential trust documents suddenly requested from archives nobody had opened in decades. Inside the executive boardroom on the 72nd floor, the atmosphere felt tight enough to crack. Ethan Cole stood near the massive windows overlooking the city, silent, hands folded behind his back. He had barely slept. The events of the previous night replayed endlessly in his mind. Claire's voice. The faded shareholder document. The realization that he had spent 6 months walking past one of the owners of the company without ever truly seeing her. Around the table, Board members whispered nervously while legal teams arranged stacks of confidential folders in front of each chair. What exactly is this about? One investor demanded quietly. Another adjusted his tie with visible unease. If this concerns the merger delay, we should have received notice before market open. Ethan finally turned toward the room. His expression remained composed, but something about him looked different this morning. Less certain, more honest somehow. You are about to receive information regarding the original Whitmore and Cole Trust structure, he said evenly. Silence fell immediately. Several older executives exchanged startled looks at the mention of the Whitmore name. Most younger board members looked confused entirely. One attorney stepped forward and opened a leather portfolio carefully. As of this morning, previously sealed shareholder protections connected to the Whitmore Family Trust have been legally verified and activated. Papers slid across the table. I scanned documents rapidly. Then the reactions began. Confusion first. Then disbelief. Then complete silence. 50% ownership? Someone whispered. Another executive looked up sharply. There is no surviving Whitmore heir. Ethan said nothing. The boardroom doors opened softly behind him before anyone else could speak again. Every head turned immediately. Claire Whitmore entered the room wearing a charcoal gray suit instead of the black waitress uniform from the night before. Simple, elegant, calm. Her blonde hair rested neatly against her shoulders, and the silver watch Ethan recognized immediately remained on her wrist beneath the sleeve of the jacket. Nobody in the room breathed for a second. It was not because she suddenly looked powerful. It was because they realized she always had been. The same woman they had ignored while asking for more coffee now walked through the boardroom, carrying ownership authority over half the company. One investor stood too quickly, knocking his chair backward against the polished floor. Another executive looked physically pale. Claire paused near the center of the room, her expression composed as sunlight reflected softly across the glass walls behind her. Ethan watched the board members stare at her with entirely different eyes now. Respect, fear, calculation. Exactly the transformation Claire had warned him about downstairs. Good morning, she said softly. No one answered immediately. Finally, the senior attorney cleared his throat awkwardly. Miss Whitmore, we were not aware. Claire gave a faint smile. I know. Her voice carried no arrogance. Somehow that only deepened the discomfort around the table. One executive lowered his eyes completely, clearly remembering how casually he had dismissed her the night before. Another stared at the documents in front of him as though hoping they might suddenly become less real. Ethan stepped forward slowly. The trust documents have been fully authenticated, he said. Effective immediately, Claire Whitmore resumes all shareholder rights attached to the original Whitmore family holdings. The room remained frozen. Claire looked around the table quietly, recognizing nearly every face from months of serving coffee, wine, and executive dinners upstairs. Men who had debated billion-dollar deals in front of her without ever asking her name. People who believed status determined human value. Last night, she said calmly, many of you spoke very freely around someone you believed did not matter. No one interrupted her. That is the danger of power, she continued softly. It convinces people they only need to be kind when someone can affect them. The silence that followed felt almost unbearable. Ethan looked down briefly, knowing the words included him more than anyone else in the room. Claire noticed. Then, unexpectedly, her expression softened slightly. But companies do not fail because of financial losses first, she said quietly. They fail because people stop seeing each other clearly. Sunlight spread slowly across the long marble table while the city moved endlessly below them. Claire stepped toward the empty chair positioned at the head of the boardroom beside Ethan's. The seat that had always belonged to the Whitmore family before history quietly erased it. Ethan looked at the chair, then at her. Without speaking, he pulled it back for her himself. Not because she owned half the company, not because the board was watching, but because for the first time since meeting her, he finally understood the difference between power and respect. Claire sat down calmly while the room watched in complete silence. And somewhere deep inside Cole International, something far more important than ownership had finally changed.